Ever been injured as a runner? Very likely, I would say. How do you see an injury when it happens? Could it have been prevented? Could you do more to make sure it doesn't happen again? In a world where we as runners find ourselves injured, continually fighting that injury, are we running towards injury or are we running from injury? Hello and welcome to the Ultra Running Podcast with me, Coach Marshy. So injury is a massive topic in our sport of ultra running and in the running world in general. And when we talk about injury, there's lots of discussions, there's lots of Dr. Google going on, and there's lots of anecdotal advice out there on the web. But for me, personal experience and what people find out is a really good way of learning. So that brings me to today's guest. So on that note, let's bring them in. So I would just like to welcome Peter Francis to the show. Hello, Peter. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Coach. How you doing? Good to be here.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
Good, good.
Excellent. So before we get into it, Peter, tell me a little bit about yourself, your involvement in running. Are you part of a club? Do you run regularly still? What is your involvement with running?
Yeah, I still run most weeks. Not maybe as fast as I used to, but yeah, running's been a big part of my life since I'm 15 years of age, really. Yeah, it really motivated me in all areas of my life, and unfortunately, I had a lot of injuries, which meant I spent a lot of my 20s without running. But I'm pleased to say I learned a bit along the way, got my running back on track, and now I help people do the same.
Excellent. So you kind of like paying it forward as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Excellent. So in terms of how you do that, you and I know that you're an author of a book. So just give me a quick introduction to that book, just so people know where you're positioned and how you get that message out to people. So the book itself.
Yeah, so the book is Running from Injury, and it came about because I started running when I was 15. By the time I was 18, 19, I was injured, and I was injured for the next 10 or 12 years. And so during that time, I did a load of science study. I did 3 degrees. I did all my coaching qualifications. I worked with teams. I worked with athletes. And one day in my late 20s, I started to think, maybe I could have another go at this, because I just started to kind of see the color picture, and I started to be able to help other athletes. And I thought, well, maybe I could have one more go. And so I did, and I put together a very different kind of training program than what I would have done first time around. And it worked, and I ran for 3 years. And so then I started a blog and decided, right, I've got to get this information out to other runners. And then that was really where the idea for the book came from. And so the book is in 2 parts. The first part is 10 chapters on why we get injured. And I try to basically explain in simple, clear terms why all running injuries occur. And my hope is that the reader understands that so well that they almost wouldn't even need to read the second section of the book, because it's like, if you intuitively can understand the problem in such simple terms, then the answers become obvious. It's basically doing the reverse of the problems, you know. So yeah, that's the kind of the quick version of how the book came to be. Yeah.
So do you run as part of a club yourself? Are you part of a running club at all?
I ran for many years as part of a club here in Ireland called Ferrybank, but now it's just recreational. I just get out a couple of times a week myself now. Yeah. Excellent.
And in terms of your coaching, is that done online? Do you do it one-on-one? Do you help people? How do you actually put those sessions across? Do you do any of that?
So I help certain individuals from time to time, or I go on training camps, sometimes with international athletes. So some of the Irish squads. That would be mainly what I do nowadays. I used to be the endurance coach at the university where I studied for about 3 years, and before that at a juvenile kids athletics club for a few years. But I don't have a formal kind of running coaching role at the moment. Just being busy, basically.
No, excellent. Good. It's always good to know a bit of history about that as well. So running injuries. Now, I like to think of it as quite simple as well, and it'll be interesting to see what you say. But what I find as a coach is this is a can of worms, and it's a can of worms because there's so much information. You don't know whether it's credible, and people have massive opinions about why they're injured, and they've not even been diagnosed. So in terms of running injuries, Peter, what was it in your own kind of journey that you mentioned there that started to make you realize you wanted to look into the why more?
I suppose in the end, it's unsatisfactory outcomes, isn't it? If you're injured for a long time, then everybody's opinion and advice and service and diagnosis and assessment hasn't really worked, has it? So so I suppose that happens over time. But then, as I said, I was lucky that my career path was also, going in that direction. So the two things are happening at once. I'm not getting resolution to the issues, but I'm also learning a lot about that field. And so when you mentioned about the minefield of information. The last chapter in the book is actually called "A Little Less Information," because
Right.
I actually think the information is part of the problem. To me, an injury, very simply, is a training error, and people, sometimes see that as a little bit oversimplistic, but it's true in that something has changed too quickly.
Yeah.
And you could be unlucky. I mean, it could be something in your daily life. It could be something in your job, but often with runners, it's something in their training has changed too quickly. And, I think people nowadays want a much more complicated answer than that, but that's the reality,
Yeah, no, I actually really agree. I think I've looked through some of your bits before the show, and yeah, I'm reading it, and it's actually making a lot of sense to me. And I think obviously you and I perhaps aren't going to sit here and talk about specific diagnosis, but when it comes to those common injuries within runners, we'll go on to what you think the theory is in a second. But do you think those common injuries are all kind of curable by the same process? So, the ones that come to mind: plantar fasciitis, the common runner's knee, these things, they're under the same kind of theory as what you're putting across.
Well, what's interesting about those injuries is they all have things in common. So you're right. The top 5 injuries, they all occur from the knee down for a start. They all come on gradually, so they're not traumatic, like when you break your leg or something. So they all come on slowly. They're all due to repetitive overuse. They all have a link with some sort of what I would call blunt kind of running form biomechanics. Maybe plodding would be the kind of more general term. And interestingly, none of them ever occur to muscles. And that was something that when we were studying injuries in football players, when I worked in Leeds, I started to notice, hang on, these football guys, they get loads of muscle injuries. And then I was like, But us runners over here, we don't really get any of those. Now, when you think about what makes you move and what makes you control your landing, well, it should be muscles. So we should be using our muscles quite a lot, really. But that got me thinking, why are runners kind of overloading these small little structures that are not designed for producing and absorbing load? So yeah, those injuries have a lot in common, and therefore you're right. The solutions will have a lot in common as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, no, that is so great to hear that, and really good to hear. And there is a book over my shoulder there on my bookcase, which is The Lost Art of Running by Shane Benzie, which has a similar kind of approach to biomechanics. Definitely. That's really quite interesting what you say there about the common factors. So when you talk about running injuries and you talk about those common injuries that we've kind of touched on there, what would you say is the kind of common causes, and what's the common solution to that as well?
So I always like to with an injury, look for the biggest factors that are going to make the most amount of difference, and then work into some of the other factors. So, the number one risk factor for most injuries in most sports is going to be previous injury. So, unfortunately, there's not much you can do about that. So, whatever injuries you've had in the past are going to increase your likelihood of getting a new one. So it's good to know that, but it doesn't help us a huge amount. The second thing is change in loading. So if you increase your miles too quickly, that will cause a problem. But that's an easy one to see. But think about other things. If you change your surface too quickly, or if you change your footwear too quickly, or so anything where you change a variable too quickly is gonna cause a problem. Now, the next thing then is like low movement variability. So running is a sport that's repetitive in nature. There is not very much variability in it anyway. Now, we can make that better or we can make it worse. So if you run at the same speed, the same distance, the same loop, the same, there's very little movement variability there. So you're going to probably increase your likelihood of an overuse injury. Whereas if you were able to, interject some changes of pace into your running, interject some hills into it, maybe interject some training outside of running, like yoga or circuit training or whatever, you're going to increase the variability. So low movement variability would be another factor. And then you see we're going from previous injury, changing something too quickly, lack of movement variability. Then we can start to get into things that might be interesting, like, biomechanics and so on. Yeah, there is a certain style of running, probably influenced as well by the height and the weight of the runner as well. That does play a role. But I would say most people want to start there. Whereas what I would say is, unless you've looked at the bigger factors that make the bigger difference, then don't sweat about getting a detailed biomechanical analysis, because let's say we get that biomechanical analysis, we fix all the things that we think are wrong in your stride or whatever it is. If you change your load too quickly, or if you do too much of the same thing, it doesn't matter. So
yeah.
Like you've got to start with the big factors first, and then get into the small ones.
So what would you say the top big factors are, like, if you had to really just list them?
So changing your training too quickly.
Yeah.
is the main one.
Yeah.
And doing too much of the same thing, I would say, is the second one.
And when you see the everyday runner out there, and you know, with the pandemic recently, I think running's probably been taken up by a lot of non-runners. It's become more used as a common kind of way of getting some exercise, with all the gyms being closed and whatever else. Do you think runners are aware of this?
Well, I think that's a good point, because if you're new to it, then all those factors I mentioned go up a notch. Because, you know, if you're a runner who changes something too quickly, that's one thing. But if you've never run and you come in, that's a huge change in loading to your body. So the concepts are the same, whether you're an elite athlete or a couch to 5K athlete. But maybe some people are going to be predisposed even more so to picking up an injury. Like you mentioned, people who've never run before, their body needs a transition period into the sport of running. So yeah, I think people who've taken it up in the pandemic, they're going to be at risk for a lot of things. One, they haven't done much running before. You know, two, maybe they haven't run on the roads much before, or, you know, so you know, or even just more broadly, they spend a lot of time sitting at home, you know, working from home, quite a sedentary lifestyle, and then trying to take up running out of nowhere, you know. So yeah, all those factors will play a role.
Yeah, no, really interesting this. In terms of my coaching, and on this podcast, I don't often go into it in too much depth, but I would say you and I are on a similar page, or very much the same page. It seems to be that overcomplicating it is just the way the world's gone. It's the way the web's gone. It sometimes is the way the I don't mean to offend anyone who's listening, but the cheap quick qualification, I don't like it. And you know, it can create a lot of bad information or misinformation and over information. And it's that, you know, the last chapter in your book, you know, little less information, or you know, along those lines. It's, yeah, we're probably on the same page. I think we are very much listening to what you're saying there, and I completely back it, actually. You know, a little, you know, you say it might be a little bit too simplistic, but actually it's obvious. If you, as you said, if you think about it, it's obvious, right?
Yeah.
No, it's really cool. So with that in mind, I get a lot of runners come to me, a lot of plantar fasciitis, a lot of runner's knee, piriformis syndrome, but never been diagnosed by a qualified professional, but because Dr. Google said that must be it. You know, we get lots of that as coaches. People come to us and say those kinds of things. And you mentioned there kind of circuit training, yoga, sort of that cross training style of thing. What is your perspective and stance around strength and conditioning for runners?
Well, strength and conditioning, sometimes its name can give people all sorts of ideas of what it is or what it isn't. So again, like that, I like to strip all those concepts back and just say, well, if you do, if you run up a hill, you have to bend your hip, knee, and ankle in a way that you don't when you're running on the flat. So if you bend your hip, knee, and ankle, you've got to use muscles all the way up and down the chain. So therefore, running up a hill is strength and conditioning. If you sprint, if you run as fast as you possibly can, like you did when you were a kid, that's strength and conditioning. If you do Pilates, that's strength and conditioning. If you do circuit training, that's strength and conditioning. Or if you do the nice, you know, more modern, sophisticated Olympic lifting in the gym, or box jumps, or whatever you want to say, that's strength and conditioning. But the point here is we're using our body through a range of motion, which requires us to use all of our muscles and requires us to use them variably. That's all that's actually happening. So again, that whole field, which as somebody who teaches on those courses that produces those graduates, that whole field can be overcomplicated in itself as well. And so, sometimes I do an exercise where I show people a change in stride mechanics when you run barefoot, a change in stride mechanics when you sprint, a change in stride mechanics when you run up a hill, a change in stride mechanics when you do a squat with a barbell. And I just asked them to say, well, what do all those things have in common? And what they all have in common is the flexing of the lower extremity, the ankle, the knee, and the hip, and the use of muscles. Another thing they all have in common is that they're going to add variability to training. And so if I start to introduce variability, even if I get the strength and conditioning wrong, I'm doing the wrong strength, I've introduced variability. So even if I just introduce variability and that's the end of it, I've already helped with my issues, because like we've discussed already, even if I introduce the wrong strength and conditioning, and it means I don't change my running load too quickly, brilliant, because now I'm not just solely running all the time. So I think with strength and conditioning, I think it's very, very important, because we live in a modern sedentary world where we kind of nearly need strength and conditioning to replace climbing over walls and climbing trees and jumping fences and all the stuff we don't do anymore. So to almost like combat the smartphone and the tablet usage, we need strength and conditioning. So I think it's useful just for the average human. So therefore it's going to be useful for a runner as well. But again, I would just say to people, don't sweat the details. Just get up and use your body fully and differently, and then you'll be fine.
Love that. Absolutely love that. Don't even know where to start with that, because that was, well, if I could take a caption of something and put it out there to the world, it would be those 4 minutes that we've just discussed, because I actually couldn't agree more with that. I think if we just touch on the point that you made at the beginning of that about the graduates that you're teaching and part of, that overcomplication, it's a while since I was at uni now, but I was at Nottingham Trent University, and that had a new strength and conditioning additional course that you could do as part of your module. And one of my housemates, he did it, and he talked about all this fancy stuff that they were doing. But the truth was, it was just what you've just said. It was variability. That's all it really was. When you break it down, that's what it was. It was just doing some training with those joints, with those muscles, in a way that is perhaps different to running on a flat. Yeah. In a basic sense. So that was really interesting to point out there. But also the barefoot question, my previous episode was talking to a guy called Kevin who is completely transitioned now to being a barefoot runner. By the sounds of what you've just said, using barefoot shoes would be a good tool for runners to use because of the variability in it.
Yeah, it will, I suppose, by default. Yeah, it will introduce variability. The foot is a very variable structure, 26 bones, 33 joints. So it's designed to move in a variety of ways. People who spend more time barefoot have bigger and stronger feet muscles. So when you think about the fact that your feet are the springs beneath the whole operation, then having them well conditioned and strong would make a lot of sense. So yeah, I mean, barefoot running was the resolution to my own plantar fasciitis issues, which is where I first developed an interest in it. And then we did a lot more scientific studies on it because of my initial surprise with what I experienced myself, and then what I started to see in other runners clinically as well. So
what did you find with that? What did you find with the barefoot running for the plantar fasciitis specifically?
Well, after my own experience, we started to do some case series with other runners who also had a positive response to barefoot running on a nice kind of soft grass surface. And when most runners, when they ran every second day barefoot on a soft grass surface, had an improvement in their symptoms with barefoot running. And we're going to publish a study soon, hopefully, where 19 out of 20 runners demonstrated this improvement. Now, we don't know all the reasons why yet, but one of the theories is that as your feet, foot muscles weaken from being in shoes and so on, that the loading to the plantar fascia, because the arch is kind of bending, and it's kind of repetitively loading the plantar fascia and overloading the plantar fascia, that's causing some of the issues. So in some ways it would make sense if you restore the foot muscles and the stiffness in the arch, you lower the burden on the plantar fascia. But yeah, there's lots of different explanations for why, but that's one of the main ones.
Yeah, no, really interesting, really interesting. So I have suffered with that in the past. Do you believe in the theory that it's something that can be resolved then? Some people think it never goes away.
My own experience is that it went away and never came back once I, figured it out. But, it's important to acknowledge the nuance in this, in terms of, if you, for example, were to listen to this episode and kind of pick it up incorrectly, you might go out tomorrow, ditch your shoes, start running, and you could actually get plantar fasciitis that way too, because what would happen is your feet muscles are not conditioned. So then you go and run barefoot, and that's going to put a big loading through your foot. So there's quite a bit of nuance with, I think with adults, transitioning is important. If you do want to do some barefoot, I always found as a runner that on the grass or on a medium firm sand, that it was easier to maintain a rhythm and a cadence and a kind of a normal running form, knowing that there was a little bit of give in the ground underneath. But it also meant that it was a bit easier on the body. So it allowed some time to adapt. And I think if you do that slowly as an adult, that's important. When it comes to kids, the key with kids is just to have them barefoot from the beginning. And if they can't be barefoot, have them minimalist from the beginning, because the way their Achilles tendon and everything will develop, and their foot shape and size, and their arch stiffness and so on, will be so much better. So, with adults, we've got to take our time and transition, and we can see huge improvements in resolution. And in some people, it's incredible what happens. but it's more difficult for us. And the amount of change we can create is probably limited. Whereas with the kids, there's a huge opportunity for prevention, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I do currently is it'll be interesting to see what you think to this. I don't have a desire to be a barefoot runner for ultra running or marathons, but I definitely acknowledge some of the stuff you're saying there in terms of the strengthening of the foot, and actually the basics that people forget that you mentioned there about how many bones and joints there are actually in the foot. And with all that in mind, I've been trying to put some barefoot work in. So I've wore minimalistic shoes, some Vibrams, and just worn them for a small section of the warm up of my running club sessions, which is on a recreation ground, really soft grass, nice area. And I just do that for the warm up, and then I change back into my normal running trainers for the actual interval work that we do. Is that would you sort of promote that? Would you say it's a good idea? 2-3 times a week, or?
That's exactly how I recommend people get into it. So yeah. When they say to me, you know, practically, how could I start to use some of this stuff? Well, in the warm up or the cool down is a great example of a time when you can do it. And it's not going to cost you any extra time. It also means in a warm up or a cool down, it's at an easier pace, and it sort of just gives your body a chance. And then as the feet and everything else gets stronger, if you want to, you can then play with increasing it. I mean, that's how I did it in my own running career. I mean, at one point I was running 20 miles at sub 3-hour marathon pace, barefoot on Round Hay Park in Leeds. So what you can build up to is, you know, sky's the limit. But yeah. I mean, what I also like about what you're doing there is, even if you just do that, you've introduced variability into the week as well, you know, and you've introduced conditioning for the feet and the ankles as well. So even just that is going to be great, you know, as an additional thing. And then by the time you do some of your non-running strength and conditioning, and by the time you maybe do some hills and do some whatever, all of a sudden now you've got a varied program with lots of different types of running in it, and you're not just you know, using the one movement strategy. I mean, even when I was competing at a decent level, you know, I never did workouts or ran hard on the road without a shoe, you know, because there's no compliance in the concrete. So I always felt to run at any sort of decent pace, you needed some compliance. I don't think by the way, I don't think there's a special type of shoe, but just some compliance to overcome the concrete. Or because your brain and your body is so good at regulating all this stuff naturally, if you do want to run on the concrete, you know, if you did, for example, want to run barefoot on the concrete, you've just got to slow right down. And that's how you moderate the impact, is by slowing down. But if you want to run faster on the concrete, then you're going to need some surface compliance. And that's probably where the shoe comes in, is to just give a little bit of that compliance. And I think one of the reasons that I think as an endurance runner, you do a lot of slow running. And I think one of the reasons why the grass and so on is magic then is because you can use your normal running pace, because the grass is providing the compliance for you underfoot. So whereas you see, when I was a competitor, okay, I wanted all the barefoot running benefits, but I didn't want to slow down, because if I had to slow down so much, I'd no longer be at the fitness that I needed to be to race. So that's where barefoot running was brilliant, because all my easy runs could be done barefoot on grass. So for me, I was able to train at my normal easy run pace, except now I was barefoot on grass. But anytime I wanted to run the roads, or I wanted to do a threshold or a tempo run, or wanted to do, like, say, Saturday morning park run, or whatever, then I would use a shoe to give me the compliance on the harder surface.
So when I listen to all of this is all like music to my ears and my beliefs. And, like I said earlier, we're very much on the same page, I think, in terms of our beliefs and our the more holistic side to it, the bigger picture. But I think, do you find it hard to convince people of this stuff?
You know what? I don't really try and convince people, because it's up to them, right? So if I'm asked for my opinion, I tell them this is what I would do, or this is what I think, or if they read my book, they'll see exactly why I suggest what I'm saying. So yeah, I mean, I know what you're getting at. What I prefer to do, say if I'm doing a talk and I'm engaging with the audience, like, what I want to do is try and help people get to their own conclusion about it. So a bit like earlier when you said, like, it's obvious. That's when they're really empowered, when they understand the concept for themselves. And then you're not really convincing them, because they actually own the knowledge for themselves, because they've reasoned it themselves, So yeah, that's what I try and do.
Yeah, no, I think there's a really good lesson for me to learn there as a coach. I mean, I've been doing it a few years now. I've been doing it sort of a decade. But also probably for a lot of coaches out there, we can be guilty. And I don't know if you've done this in the past, but we can be guilty of wanting to put that opinion onto people because we think we're right. But actually, the way you've just explained it is actually you give people the information if you're asked about it. Now, your background is credible, and you've done years and years of research into it. You still look at, you're still involved now. And actually, if someone asks you your opinion, you're going to give that to them. And then with that, they come to that conclusion. And actually, that's a really good message to any coach who's listening to this, but also any runner as well. You need to go and find the information and read what's out there from an educated source. And if they read your book, like you said at the beginning, I think you said they would only read the first half of the book because they would see that it's that obvious, or in my words, that obvious. So then they've come to the conclusion, right?
Yeah, that's sort of what, and look, there's another reason for it. I mean, like, the first reason is, in life in general, if you put your opinion onto someone, if okay, great, if they're ready for it, then that will work. But if they're not, then they'll reject it, right? So that's the first reason. But there's another reason. The other reason is when the athlete or whoever is not with you, they have to be. I mean, I think a noble goal is for them to be able to think for themselves. So when you're not there, and I'll give you so many simple examples of that. If at a talk I mention yoga or something, right? There will always be somebody who says something like, there's no yoga in my area. The girl only does Pilates or whatever. Is that okay? Right. Now, if they could understand that the aim of the game is variability, breaking up sustained postures, using your muscles fully, right? They would know that the Pilates is just fine.
Yeah.
Right. But if I'm just telling them this is what you need to do, now when I'm not there, the whole system breaks down. But if you can actually think for yourself about all of those concepts, then you can go, okay, so take a hill. Oh, there's no hills where I am, but there's this one really long set of steps in the park. Now, again, if you understand the concepts there, you're going to run up and down the steps because you know that it doesn't matter about the hill. It's about shortening your stride and getting, so that's the other reason it's important, is that they can actually problem solve their own issues if they understand the concepts. Whereas if we just tell them our opinions, they can't solve anything for themselves. That's the second reason why it's a good reason to lead people to their own, through their own reasoning, with it.
No, excellent. That's awesome. That is awesome. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about your running, just to kind of finish us off. So, what does running mean to you now, and what did running mean to you as an athlete? What does it mean to you? What does it give to you?
So when I found it as a teenager, 15, 16 years of age, you're going through those teenage years where you're trying to form an identity. I was probably a bit lost, and next minute I got this, miracle drug whereby I'm running. Physically, I'm feeling good. Mentally, I'm feeling good. I'm in an athletics club where I've got other guys the same age as me who are doing the same thing. And I can remember at that point, my motivation in school and in everything went through the roof. So at that point, my relationship to running was, wow, this is changing my whole life. So then it fueled a discipline, which then led to me, the same skills, I guess, meant that I studied well at university, and I, applied those skills to my life. And then, I suppose I had a lot of disappointment with running when I fell very much out of love with running, because every time I tried to do it, I was injured. And then the relationship changed again when I learned how to do it without being injured, and the competitive part of me and the drive to improve. So I had that relationship with it, whereby firstly, I loved consistency. I loved that I could just run consistently, and I really started to love and enjoy the process. And that meant then, as I kind of focused more on the process rather than the outcome, I went from 36 minutes for 10K to 35 to 34 to 33. And then the competitive monster took over, whereby I knew I could do the process. I knew I could be consistent all the time. And so I started to focus, can I run 32 minutes of 10K? And of course, that's when at the end of 3 years, I was exhausted. And that's when I kind of ended up retiring from the competitive arena in 2018. So then there's a whole new journey starting by, if I retire from this competitive athlete runner, what's my identity and who am I and where am I going and all of that sort of chaos. So that's what the last 3 years have been about. So the last 3 years, I now run because I still like to run. I live in the countryside. I'm on a natural 8-mile circuit with beautiful countryside all around me. So I go out a couple of times a week to stay fit, and it sort of it fuels my health, physical and mental health, I suppose. But I hike and I swim and I do other things, So whereas when I was in that competitive mindset, it was all about trying to optimize things to run as fast as I could. So it has been interesting. You talk about the relationship with running. you know, it served different purposes at different times along the way, you know.
Yeah, no, cool. So 2 more questions, and be as blunt as you like. What do you think about the ultra running world? What do you think about ultra marathon training? What do you think about ultra running? What do you think about these documentaries that are out there about these wacky events that we can now go and do as a recreational runner? You know, what do you think of the ultra running world?
It's really interesting that you've asked that question now, because I've read a book literally 3 weeks ago that's changed my perspective on it. So I'll give you my first perspective, which is the one I've had most of my life. Didn't get it at all. And I just didn't understand it. And I would get frustrated even when people would say, you know, when they would know me as a runner, and they'd say, oh, you know, which marathons have you done? And I'd say, oh, I've never done a marathon. And they'd be like, no, you know, you've definitely. And I'd be like, no, because the drive for me was always to be the best I could. And I looked at, say, 10K, and it was about, could I get faster at a distance like that? And so I never saw the point in, you know, I would have known people who sort of came into, let's just say, endurance sports and would jump straight to Ironman or, you know, whatever. And in my mind, I'd be like, you can't even do your local 10K yet, and you're going straight to this. And so I just didn't understand it. You know, I was just like, what? And then I was wondering, is it part of the societal thing where, you know, nowadays it's got to be bigger and better and, you know, all of that. So yeah, for most of the time I was just like, they must just be crazy people. I just don't get it, you know, whatever. But as I said, it was mainly because I couldn't understand it. Now, I've recently got an insight to it from, I don't know if you ever heard of David Goggins.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I read his book. That was the book I read about 2 weeks ago. Can't Hurt Me. And
Yeah.
he unlocked it in a way that I get it. I get it totally from from what he was saying, in terms of, it was an internal thing about the suffering of the mind. And basically he was doing it because of what he would learn about himself as he did it. And, you know, as he would go through all these emotions, and he'd watch them all come and go over the course of this never ending race. And it sort of developed this mental resilience in him, and it sort of taught him about what he was afraid of. And then I was like, okay, like it's a mental test. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And I understood it then, because I can relate in terms of when I did my PhD. That's the same thing. It's an endurance test. And because a PhD is not like a degree where, you know, you start here, you finish 4 years later, and that's that. It's like you finish when you're finished. So, like, you know, some people take 12 years to do it. Some people take, you know, 4 years to do it, or whatever it is. So I remember that when I was studying like that, it wasn't about intelligence. It was just about mental resilience and endurance and all of that. So since I read his book, and he talks about all that ultra stuff as a way of training the mind to be able to suffer through life.
Yeah.
That's it's now become a lot more interesting to me. I think the mistake I was making was I was comparing it to competitive sport, when it's not really about that. It's something something bigger than that. It's something more than that. I know people do race in it, but I don't feel like that's the you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a very small part of it. There obviously is always going to be a first male and a first female across that line. And the top maybe 10 in each field, you know, like Western states in America, the 100-mile foot race, it recognizes that the top 10 both females and males both qualify for next year. So there is a racing element, and those guys have got sponsorship deals now and whatever else with all the big brands. But the reality is that everything you've just said and the whole David Goggins principles that he talks about is that in reality, we're in there because we're testing ourselves against ourselves. It is against a distance, and it is against, there is going to be a clock involved because there's normally a cut-off time. But actually, like you said, the way I say it is very similar. Literally, in a 70 miles is my furthest ultra so far. In that 70-mile race, I went through every emotional state you could be in, including hypothermia, which is a physical state, but you know, that emotional state with that. So I was, that's why I was out there, because it was that resilience and that drive to keep on going. And then one of my guys who helps out with my mentorship, he says, do you know what, Marshy, if you can do an ultra marathon, then trust me, you can do this work. You just need to apply yourself in the same way. And I think that's what you've said, is that you can relate to that process and that discipline. And I think that's really key. And, you know, I think it's quite a nice, there's no ego in the ultra marathon world.
Yeah.
Very little ego. Winning's not important. So on that note, quick yes or no answer from you then. Do you think you'll ever do an ultra marathon?
Haven't read the book. It's more likely now than not. Yeah,
cool. And then just
if we did this interview 4 weeks, I would have said 4 weeks ago, I would have said never. Which that's what I like about I suppose keeping an open mind in life, is like you just never know how you're going to change, because you don't know what you don't know. You know what I mean? And you haven't read all the books and spoken to all the people. And so sometimes it's so easy to judge people for taking on a particular thing, but it really is just that you just don't understand it yet, you know. And then, you know, so, and it comes to different people at different ages, you know. And so sometimes, even one thing I like to look at nowadays is, you know, when someone first gets into running or triathlon and whatever, and they're doing all the races and they're so excited about it, you know. You know, it's great, you know, because they're kind of talking to me as if to say, why aren't you doing this? And it's like, it's just that my journey with that stuff was sort of 18 to 30. You've discovered it at 34, so you're just starting where I was at 18, you know what I mean? And so your excitement is fantastic to watch, but like, I'm doing this other path now that you might have done when you were 18, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's you come at different things at different stages in your life, and everyone bumps into stuff maybe at different ages or different times, you know.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think that's a good way to look at it, and hopefully people can take a bit of inspiration from that as well. So one last question then. What would you say your top 3 tips are for avoiding injuries in running?
Okay, the first one is, be honest with yourself in terms of where you are right now. And that doesn't matter how small that is. So, you know, I've worked with some of the most hopeless of cases, if, you know, in terms of when they come to you and say, these are all my injuries, I'm so injury prone, you know, people who are really going to give up. And what I would say to that person, or what I would say to the person who's a decent athlete, is, what can you do right now? Be honest about what you can do right now. So even if you're really badly injured right now, I would say, can you run 50 meters without pain? And if the answer is yes, that's your start point. If you were to say to me, listen, I'm fine at 40 miles a week, 4 days a week, but as soon as I go, here, there, or everywhere, I get a problem. And I'll say, right, okay, in your case, 40 miles a week. So we've one guy on 50 meters a day, and we've one guy on 40 miles a week, you know what I mean? And maybe we've another guy on 100 miles a week or whatever. So the reason that's important is, what can you do comfortably right now, is because that's your baseline. So whatever that is, you stay there and you map out a program based on that honest conversation about what your comfortable baseline is right now. You map out a program for 6 to 8 weeks based on that, and you have the discipline to stick with that, then you won't have a problem. Now, you can then make these incremental gains slowly over time, and you rarely get injured. So that's the first thing. The second thing is movement variability. Even if you just park your car 20 minutes from work and walk 20 minutes down and 20 minutes back, walking introduces movement variability. And I just think, as a society, particularly if you're not in a job that requires manual labor, you need to find different ways of moving, particularly with running being so low on movement variability as a sport. So introduce variability. And the third one, I would say, I mean, there's lots of ones, but the third one I would say is, make sure you've got enough headspace. So if you really value running and you want it to be a part of your life or whatever, you got to have the time to do it. So if you're running from one stressed out situation to another stressed, and then squeezing in your running for an hour and a half, that's going to play a role in your injuries. So you've got to look at, what are you going to take out of your life to just make a bit of room, because that's the big breakthrough for me. Wasn't what I learned about with training, it was what I learned about with behavioral psychology. Doing too much is because you can't delay gratification, and that applies to your training and to your daily life. You're taking on too much, so also the reason it's important is, you need headspace to be creative. So in order to identify where the local yoga class is and get booked into it and anything new like that requires a bit of brain space. So it's important for that reason as well. So yeah, one, be honest, don't change anything too quickly. Two, be creative in terms of introducing variability. And three, give yourself enough headspace to be able to do all that.
Awesome. So thanks very much for coming on the show. Really enjoyed it. I've learned so much actually myself there, and lots of things to think about for me as well. I'll certainly be I'll be reading the book for sure. I'm looking forward to that actually. It'll definitely be jumping up my book list as well in terms of what's next on my reading list. So for anyone who's listened, how would they find out more about what you do?
So everything is on peterfrancis.blog.
Yep.
And the book is on Amazon.
Awesome. So they can look there. What I'll do is on the YouTube, anyone who's watching on YouTube, I'll stick those links in the description below as well, and make sure it's in the description on the audio as well, so you guys can find it if you want to have a look in more depth. I certainly will be, and I'll be looking forward to continuing following that blog and that journey. So and that future research as well, or the research that you mentioned there, that's potentially exciting. So I'll have a read of anything I can find from that as well. So guys, I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and hopefully we can meet here again another time to discuss more on the Ultra Running Podcast with me, Coach Marshy.